Welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue into session 2, and this session is called Trauma-Informed Programming. I just want to say, as I reviewed the first session, that I kind of clicked my slides a little quicker than my words, or there was some kind of lag in there. So I will, in this one, I will try to make sure that I complete my speaking before I go to the next slide. Um, as we consider the stuff that we talked about in the first session, and as we move into this session, I would encourage you to think about ministries that you've been in before, places that you've been in before. As I look back, as some of you may know, I was a residential camp director for 15 years for the Salvation Army, and as I look back at some of the issues that we had to deal with campers. And certainly, in seeing what is going on with campers in our camps today, this was going on maybe 8 years ago, and what we're seeing today is that there was a progression over the years of behaviors that were manifest in children that were coming to our camps, and we noticed that from the time that we had started in camp to the time that we had left at camp, that the amount of medications that children were bringing with them to camp really, really had increased. And it seems like we were dealing with more medicated children in our midst. And we were also dealing with staff members that we came to know that were dealing with certain levels of trauma in their own lives. And as I look back on that time, and really, I think that in those early days, I mean, even in the last 5 years, when we talk about youth ministry or even core ministry, we the the thought of being trauma informed just it hasn't been part of the language. So I'm happy that it is now part of the language, and I'm happy to see that we're moving along in that direction. But as I look back at some of the issues that we dealt with campers being armed with this information that we have today, I probably would have handled a lot of situations a lot differently. That children can really test staff members, and adults can also test staff members. And when we're continually asking ourselves, where is this coming from, instead of what's wrong with you, perhaps our approach will be a lot different as we go into that. I had a huge incident that happened in camp once that resulted in an investigation, and it was one of those incidents that really has stuck with me all of these years. And when we're in person, in the fall, I want to talk to you a little bit more about that situation. But there was so much to be learned from that incident with this child, an 8-year-old child who came to camp and had so much rage and so much anger and so much pain in his life. And quite frankly, our responses were not trauma informed. Obviously, it was a situation that became an emergency, but um, I took a lot away from that, and that particular situation in camp has always come back to me, and it always broke my heart. And I think that our hearts always need to be broken for what's going on with the people that we're serving, and just a disappointment over what we could have done better. And so we're in a time now where we are able to provide information. There's information available to us. There's opportunities for us to be able to sit back and say, how can we do this better? How can we be intentional in our programming to ensure that we are protecting people from all sides? And so I hope that as we dive into the information in this session, that number one, that it doesn't overwhelm you. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of information on trauma-informed care. And if you go back to that picture of the house that was full of stuff, there's a lot to unpack there. And so my goal again is to just make sure to provide you with enough information that you can be aware, and that you can go back and when you get into your appointment and you're dealing with certain issues, that that there's places that you can go to um, to find information, to find that assistance that you may need to deal with particular situations in your care. So on that note, we are going to press on and get into this session. So here's an overview of what we're going to be doing in this session. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I don't want to take up your time, but to kind of get you through here with what we're going to be looking at. So the first thing that I'd like for you to do is you're going to pause this video right now, this presentation, and I'd like for you to go to the link. I believe it's probably in your activities or provided where you can go to it. And I would like for you to watch this this talk by Diane Langberg, where she's talking about trauma as being a place of service. And as you're watching it and absorbing what she says, and particularly the things that she says about dungeons and heaven. And I just want I just want you to kind of reflect on that as you're watching this, and just ask yourself, how does this inform your thoughts on how you will respond to trauma when you step into your first appointment and your ongoing appointments beyond that? So if you can pause right now, watch that, and then we'll come back. Um, that's a pretty powerful video or talk by Diane Langberg. And one of the things that stood out to me very clearly is when she was talking about the dungeon below, and that there was a chapel service right above it. That just really kind of rang out to me about priorities that are not in the right place, really, but the thought that worship of God was happening above these people who were suffering, and that worship needed to come down to them. So often when we enter into another's suffering, we try to drag them into our world. We want them to think what we think, choose what we would choose, understand what we see, and live more like we do. We want them to leave their depression, sorrow, and grief behind and get over it. Now, of course, you think about those people in that dungeon. There is no way that trauma is going to be something that they can just get over. Those are horrible conditions. And that's a worst case scenario. But when you think about the people that we're serving, the people that we're working with, um, we can't just say, just get over it. Even when our nerves have been tested beyond belief and we don't know what to do, the answer is not just get over it. So as we think about this, this really struck out to me a while ago about a tradition of skepticism. And that says that before the mid-1970s, much of the psychiatric, psychological, medical, and sociological writing on child sexual abuse downplayed the seriousness of the problem. And what followed with that is these points, is that the understanding is that child sexual abuse is the child's fault. Number two, mothers are to blame for child sexual abuse. Next, child sexual abuse is rare. Child sexual abuse does not harm the child. And finally, the child is lying. And I often, when I go and do workshops and I'm trying to help people understand why it's important that we be aware of these things today, I always like to pose the question, are we inadvertently operating with a skeptical mindset? And when it comes to trauma, that would ask the individual with trauma, what's wrong with you? Now, obviously, we know that research, the pre-mid 1970s about child sexual abuse, what we know about child sexual abuse now is that it is never the child's fault. And yes, some mothers may be to blame for child sexual abuse, but that's not the case in every single case. There are many different factors that are to blame for child sexual abuse, but it's not the mother's fault. we do know that the prevalence of child sexual abuse is quite high, and it's estimated to be 3 times what's actually reported. We do know, as we're talking about trauma, that child sexual abuse does harm the child. And we also know that when a child comes forward and discloses abuse, that less than 95 that 95% of the time, if not more, they are telling the truth. So that turns out to be that less than 5% of the time that the child is lying. And so that really kind of puts into perspective what our role is when it comes to issues like this. And are we just brushing bad behavior off as something that's getting in our way? Are we asking these people, what's wrong with you? When we think about trauma informed care and our core or our program, kind of going back to the ecological model here, is that there are societal expectations, organizational expectations, and community expectations. And in that is encapsulated the child. And I'd also say here that, it says the child here, but we're also talking about a vulnerable adult or any other person who may be in trauma. But we're going to look at this from a societal perspective. Society expects us as an organization to really be abiding by the laws that are there. And we talk about that, the ecological model and those societal functions that we have that should be providing protective factors around children and the people that we serve, and understanding what the social conditions are within the communities that we're serving in, and how can we best suit that community, and what are the expectations that society has of us as an organization. We are the Salvation Army, and that's quite a big name. And I think that, beyond people's perception of a kettle or a thrift store, um, they probably don't realize the breadth of the programs that we provide, and how in those programs we need to make sure that we have the um, the resources that we need to be able to do those programs safely. And then, of course, from an organizational perspective, parents and leadership are always expecting that policies are going to be living and active within our programs. And again, going back to that culture of safety and looking at the program type, and is that program type appropriate for the population that you're serving? And would that program thereby possibly re-traumatize a child or another person? And then again, the expectations of the community around the person, the family, the peers, the pastors, the youth workers, members, guests, anybody who is coming into contact with the child or the person who is in trauma or surviving from trauma, and really how all of these things, again, are working together to ensure that the bottom line is that the child or the person is going to be protected. So, trauma-informed Salvation Army programming. As pastors, you know that you are called to save souls, grow saints, and serve suffering humanity. That's something that we hear about a lot in the Salvation Army. But how do we look at these functions of Army ministry through a trauma-informed lens? When we think about saving souls and growing saints and serving suffering humanity, what does that look like through the trauma-informed lens? How can we do everything that is required just in those 3 little functions and still provide trauma-informed care? How can you come out of the chapel and take heaven to the dungeons? And I just want to speak a moment to the reality of a Salvation Army officer or any leader in the Salvation Army, but a Salvation Army officer, you are appointed to a new corps or a new program that you go in and you wear many different hats. And how can you also wear the trauma-informed care hat as well? It's a lot. But as we're serving suffering humanity, as we mentioned earlier, it's important that That service now comes with some extra things that we need to do, that we need to be aware of, that we need to be breathing into the people that are coming into our programs. So when we talk about the trauma-informed approach, there are 4 R's of trauma of the trauma-informed approach. And we're going to look at these real right here. The first one is to realize the widespread impact of trauma and the pathways to recovery. Now we talked a little bit about this earlier, and I think that if you do any kind of research and if the paper that we read in the first session and stuff, we can kind of see the widespread impact of trauma. And while we may not necessarily be directly involved in the pathways to recovery, we play a part in our ministries, recognizing trauma signs and symptoms. And we did, we've talked about that a little bit, but you just never know. Each case is going to be different. And a lot of times it's going to be something that comes out of the behaviors that we're experiencing, the things that we're going to be dealing with, where we may just see it as bad behavior, but it might be because there's some kind of trauma that's pushing that, particularly when we're dealing with children. And I go back to the young child that I spoke about in my camp earlier. As I think about that little boy's face today, with the tears and the dirt and the blood um, running down his face, and just seeing how much rage was in there, I want to know. And we found out, and I will share that when we're together in the fall. But you think about it now, and it's like, wow, what happened to you? What brought you to this point? Because we don't generally see kids in that manner. So understanding that the signs and the behaviors that we may be symptomatic of something bigger. Responding by integrating knowledge about trauma into all facets of the system or to the ministry. This is a little bit clinical, and I you know we're in a lot of our ministries, we're probably not going to be there. But again, this is about boosting your awareness. And then resisting traumatization of trauma impacted individuals by decreasing the occurrence of triggers. And I think that that's probably one of the bigger areas that we need to focus on. We can be familiar with different things around us, the signs, the behaviors, but we need to be aware to not re-traumatize somebody who has been impacted by trauma. There are, when we're talking about creating a trauma-informed environment, there are 5 key principles. And I think that these are a little bit easier for us to understand and probably grasp on it about the environment that we're going to put around the child or the person who has had some trauma. First and foremost is safety. Remember that we want to create areas that are calm and comfortable, and we want to ensure the physical, emotional, and spiritual safety of the individual. Do no harm. Trust. It's important that we provide clear and consistent information and establish and maintenance of appropriate boundaries with people who may be in trauma, what they expect of us, and that they are able to fully trust us. Choice, providing the individual for options in their treatment. Now, I will say on this that this is part of these 5 key principles that you can find in a lot of different places, and we're not providing treatment per se. We're providing ministry. So providing options for the individual may be that if there's a program that a child or even an adult doesn't want to participate in, that we may want to try and encourage them to be part of the group, but if we're seeing that it's not going to work for them, that we don't push it, because again, we don't want to re-traumatize. Collaboration, and I think that this kind of tags onto that last one, making decisions together, involving others such as parents, family members, and advocates. Perhaps there's advocates in the community that will be able to help in some of these areas where we're experiencing difficulty with managing behaviors. And empowerment, noticing capabilities in the individual, building those skills, that advance recovery. And again, that's another clinical term. I would say that building skills that help to advance their resilience, um, and to help the individual discover their strengths. And a lot of times, just in that, a child or even an adult that feels hopeless or whatever, if they have one person that's speaking life into them, wow, what a difference that can make. And I think that you've been called to ministry. I don't have to tell you this, but sometimes when we do get bogged down in all the stuff that is required for saving souls, growing saints, and serving suffering humanity, that sometimes uh, these little folks may get caught up in in our busyness, and the safety may erode because we're not paying the attention to them that they need. So we've mentioned re-traumatization a couple times, and this is about what hurts. And if you think about somebody who's been in trauma and they're trying to get away from that, obviously we want to make sure that we are providing them the steps and the opportunities to step away from it. As far as the system is concerned, this refers to policies, procedures, and the way that things are done. And I don't want this to conflict with anything that we said earlier when we talked about protective factors. Yes, policies and procedures are important, but we don't want them to be overly punitive to children or adults that are in trauma. I'm not. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm not saying that we're letting people break the rules. We just may have to approach things a little bit differently based on the circumstances. So for a system, if a person has to continually tell their story, that can re-traumatize them. And then if they're also being treated as a statistic, we're not interacting with them as a human being. We're interacting with them as a human. Procedures that require disrobing, uh, this this may this probably is not going to take place in your core or your program. It may, depending on if you're going swimming or camping or whatever it may be. Um, but understanding that something as simple as changing clothes or even bathroom procedures may be traumatic for somebody, and how we need to be sensitive to that. Being seen as their label. For example, if somebody's got an addiction program, or children that have ADHD, or whatever else it is that we don't identify them by that. We identify them by the person that they are. No choice in the service or no choice in service or treatment. And again, that's getting back more to a clinical level. But are we providing choices in their programs? And if it's not working for them, is there an alternative? And no opportunity to give feedback about their experience with the service delivery. And again, clinical, but is there an opportunity for people um, to provide feedback? Have you built that trust that they feel comfortable enough to share with you something that may make them feel uncomfortable? And then moving into the area of relationship of re-traumatization, um, we're dealing with more of the relationships that are so important in ministry. And so we know that if we lose trust in that relationship, that's obviously going to be traumatizing again. So we talk about relationship, about being not being seen or heard, that trust is violated, failure to ensure emotional safety, and I would say also on that, failure to provide spiritual safety. I think that it's important for us to remember that as core officers, as pastors, you're going to be seen as the pastor. And it's important that people's expectations of a pastor will flow through that. And that is the love of Christ, and meeting people where they are as Christ would. They're non-collaborative. Um, Again, going back to, are we involving people that need to be involved, especially if we're dealing with particularly difficult situations. does things for rather than with, and use of punitive treatment, coercive practices, and oppressive language. And I would just say on this that, one of the things that I've been very sensitive to in working in camp with camp counselors or working at a Croc Center with program leaders, and when you have groups of kids, and groups of kids have been assigned to a leader, and if you think about this within your core, and you're trying to get everybody together, and it starts coming out as that everybody's shouting, all the counselors are shouting, all the leaders are shouting, and what does that say? Number one, about people that may be bystanders and looking in on it, but also what does it say about how are we treating those people, that are in our care, and the language that we're using to communicate with them, and the practices that we're using to, if we have behavioral problems, how are we working through that as well. I like to talk about the continuum of behaviors. And as I've shared all of this information, I don't want you to think that we that that we don't have a responsibility in in this management of undesired behaviors, of saying that we're going to, that we just kind of have to accept these behaviors, and we have to change everything so that this person can feel comfortable. And I don't think that that's what trauma informed care is about. Obviously, if we're in a situation where the safety and well-being of others around the situation are, we need to make sure that um, we are addressing behaviors, and that we're not letting them overtake our programs, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I like to look at the continuum of behaviors, and this is where we're talking about what behaviors are acceptable, how can we redirect, and when do we need to assess to see where we need to go next. Quite frankly, there may be some situations that come through your doors that you are not qualified to handle, and that's okay. But it's about how we can use the information that we have to be able to redirect that or the service to where there are people that are qualified to handle it. So obviously, when we look at this continuum, the green zone is obviously the place that we all want to be, safe and protective. This is the ideal location that we want to be. You move into the yellow, that is the potentially risky area. And this is where you're dealing with some behaviors that are probably manageable, and hopefully we're able to redirect them to get back into the protective, and safe area. And then on the other end of the scale is the harmful and abusive, and that's where we need to look at things about how we can how do we mitigate the behaviors that we're dealing with, and at what point do we have to turn it over to somebody else. So obviously, when we see behaviors that are going from green and starting to turn maybe a little light green because they're getting some yellow in there, it's important that redirection happen in this space. And with that redirection, again, we want to make sure that we're using the proper language, the proper tone, and that we're really doing it to help the person through this, and to get them back into that self and protective area. And part of redirection is really asking, have we slipped? Have we drifted away from our trauma informed practice if we're dealing with a child in trauma, or an adult that's in trauma, because this works for them as well too. And I'm also going to say, as we're dealing with behaviors, not every behavioral issue that you're going to deal with stems from a child that's in trauma. Some kids are just rambunctious, and we have to deal with that. But we're talking about the ones that really um, have been dealing with some significant things in their lives. And so when we get into that yellow zone, and I would say that in a lot of our programs and core, that we're probably hanging out right in this area. just based on the nature and the makeup of the group, that we try to redirect, and if we can keep them in that light green area, that's great. But as we've said, we're serving suffering humanity, and there's a lot of different things that are going to come with that, and we have to be prepared for it. So when we start to get into that red zone and we talk about harmful and abusive, this is where the behavior is really getting to the point where we are unable to care for this person. We're not able to manage the behavior, and the person has become dangerous to other people around them, whether it be other leaders, whether it be other children, other adults, whoever is involved in the program. And that's where you in your leadership have to make an assessment about how do we where do we go from here? What are the steps that we need to take, and do we need to make an assessment about, is this the appropriate program for this person to be in? Are there alternatives? Have we engaged local community advocacy centers to help us through some of those challenging behaviors? And at what point do you have to say, this program's not going to work for you anymore? And how do you handle that so you don't re-traumatize them? And what I would say on that note is that um, we all situations are different. We never know what's going to be presented to us, and that's where you really have to, in that assessment period, you really have to make sure that you are weighing all of the alternatives to see what's the best way forward. Obviously, our goal with everything is that we want children and adults to be successful in our programs, and we want to be able to be resourced to be able to address that. But we also have other children and other adults and staff members that we have to be looking out for. And particularly when we get in this area too, you need to be thinking about yourself, and what kind of a toll is this taking on you, and is that going to guide your ability to properly manage the situation before you? So becoming trauma informed means recognizing that people often have many types of trauma in their lives, and we discussed that earlier on. People who have been traumatized need support and understanding from those around them, and that comes from you and your team, in administration, to your lay leaders, to anybody else that's around those people that we're serving. Often, trauma survivors can be re-traumatized by well-meaning caregivers and community service providers, and we certainly don't want to re-traumatize people by the way that because we mean well. We want to make sure that we are being trauma informed and providing proper care. Understanding the impact of trauma is an important first step in becoming a compassionate and supportive caregiver or officer. I would just say that, you know, as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of things that come with trauma informed care. There's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of, um, I think that there's a lot of information that's missing specifically for the church. But I think that if we're doing our best to be trauma informed and we're aware, we're going to be a step ahead of where we would have been before. I don't expect that any of us are going to be experts in this, unless some of you, maybe that was in a prior life if you worked in social services. And if that's the case, that's excellent for your core. And that's also excellent for your peers around you as well. You should share that information with them, share that resourcing with them, because it'll be very helpful in their ministry to have those resources close at hand. So application, again, as I just mentioned, you don't have to be an expert in trauma-informed care to be aware. How we interact with those in trauma needs to reflect Christ and his love. There are many resources for trauma-informed practice, schools, social service programs, etc. We need more resources for the church. I looked in preparation for this workshop, and either the information is overly clinical, or it's just too basic to really focus on the reality of what we face in the Salvation Army. So, perhaps one of you, or perhaps one of your peers, is somebody's gonna be that person that kind of breaks through that shield of um, uh, coming up with trauma-informed care for churches and for lay leaders, where you don't have to be so clinical, but you have an understanding of it. Reminder: it isn't about what's wrong with the person; it's about what happened to the person. And I think that if we can remember that, um, and we have that help direct our focus when we're dealing with people in trauma, I think we're a step ahead of the game there as well. So with that, the next steps for this workshop is I would like for you to take some time to research the community surrounding your appointment. Number one, I'd like for you to identify or check to see if there's a children's advocacy center in the community, and check on their website and determine what kind of services they provide. Is there an opportunity for collaboration with them? A children's advocacy center may be very beneficial to you if you are dealing with with a child that has some extreme trauma in their life that you're not qualified to handle with. They have counselors and services there that may be able to help you. And I know that in some circles, with some children's advocacy centers, they actually offer to come and help provide training for you and your staff. They are centered on advocating for children through their multidisciplinary teams, and there's a lot of information there with the Children's Advocacy Center in your community, but the National Children's Advocacy Center as well provides a wealth of information on trauma and all kinds of prevention and focus on children that are dealing with adverse effects in their lives. What is the socioeconomic makeup of the community that you're in, and how might your core or program be trauma informed to meet the needs of that community? And as for your assignment on this for this workshop, we're going to have you prepare a 2 to 3 page reflection paper on the information presented in this workshop. And you want to structure your reflection in 4 sections: realize, recognize, respond, and resist. And you want to also incorporate in that the 5 key principles that we talked about earlier. What is that going to look like? What is it going to look like in your core program? And I'm going to refer you to the syllabus, or to when that is due, or what's required of that. We'll have some more information on that in the activities, or wherever it's located in Blackboard. And I will be providing some additional resources to you, some websites and some things that you can be looking at. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I hope that this has provided you with a little bit more information on trauma-informed care. I am by far no expert on the subject matter, but I do care about the protection of children and vulnerable adults. And I think that this is something that we collectively need to start looking at as an organization as we move forward in the things that people are dealing with in the world today. So I would encourage you to please reach out. My contact information is here, and I wish you well, and I look forward to seeing you in the fall.